Hi guys, Adam here as per usual. Hope you are all well and welcome to 2 steps to Holdsworth Legato. Pfft, as if that's ever going to happen. Step 1, be Alan Holdsworth. Here's 2 sort of tips, 2 tricks, 2 techniques essentially that will improve the flow and the smoothness. Yeah, nearly bit me tongue there. The smoothness of your legato. Taken kind of from Holdsworth and from other examples of legato, or Sean Lane, Marshall Harrison, those kind of dudes who are ridiculous at legato. So there's 2 things. The first is what's called the all hammer-on approach, and the second is what I call the piano technique. It's the only way I know how to describe it. I've talked about these things before, but I have been getting some more questions about legato recently. I will link at the end to some older videos on these topics as well that I've done, and also on scale patterns for legato and things like that that I found particularly useful. But purely just talking about technique, there's 2 real things that will improve the kind of flow and the smoothness and the fluidity of your legato, and that is the piano technique and the all hammer-on approach. So first off, I'm going to talk about the all hammer-on approach because it's arguably the most important. When you first learn about legato, you probably more come across the terms hammer and pulls or trilling, something like that, and that kind of sounds like this. So it's where you will pick and then hammer on the next 2 notes, which is great, and then the pull off is where you literally flick the string with your finger. So all you're essentially doing is replacing picking with your right hand with picking with your left hand. You're picking the strings with your left hand fingers. Now I am kind of exaggerating that just to make it more obvious and make the effect more obvious, but what you get is a little plucking sound on the string, or at worst you can actually get a kind of bending of the string, a slight maybe quarter tone or eighth tone bending sound. Yeah, and it's cool, but it's not really legato. So compare the sound of that with the sound of this. Again, hammers and pulls and legato. Every note just sounds a bit more consistent, sounds much more similar. It almost has the same sound with each note, and the only thing we're kind of changing is the pitch, but the tone, the timbre of each note is the same. So let's look a bit into what I'm actually doing there. As the name suggests, what I'm actually doing there is all hammer-ons. It's being called hammer-on from nowhere as well, which is probably something you're more familiar with. But what I'm basically doing is the normal hammer-on procedure or process or technique for going upwards in pitch. And then what I'm doing is basically taking off, when I'm taking my little finger off the string, the index finger or whatever finger you want to use, your middle finger isn't already on the string like this. You're actually hammering down onto that note at precisely the time that you're taking your finger off the other note. Fingers have to become perfectly synchronized, because as one's coming up, the other one's coming down, so that you have to get them perfectly synchronized when you're playing. That's a really bizarre thing to be doing if anyone walked in now. The payoff is a much smoother, much more fluid and much more consistent sound, and that's what we're going for with legato, consistency. Yes, the tone, the timbre is going to change as you move up and down across the strings, of course it is, but we want to limit that as much as possible, and using all hammer-ons is going to do exactly that. The second technique is what I call the piano technique. can kind of get away with calling it sort of a let ring technique, something like that. So the idea of legato on piano was that you wouldn't release the previous note until the next note is held. On one string, it's really, really easy because the note that you're playing isn't going to stop playing until the next note you hit. The problem comes when you're crossing strings, so I'm going to over-exaggerate it for effect, but if you're crossing over strings, doing 3 notes per string, or 2 notes per string, 4 notes per string, 8 notes per string, whatever you're doing per string, when you're crossing strings, you have to be careful not to leave a tiny, minute little gap in your playing. So what you run the risk of, basically, if you're running an E major scale, what you run the risk of is getting this sound. And you have, if we imagine slowing that right down, you get a little silence, a little break in between the strings. Now when I'm crossing strings, so say for example from the D string to the G string, what I'm actually doing is trying to have this sound play out for just the tiniest minute amount of time. So what I'm doing is and that sounds, well, I think it sounds alright, but most people would say that sounds horrible, that sounds disgusting, the harmony's too close. But because it's only for such a small amount of time, you don't hear the harmony. What you hear is just absolutely no gaps between the notes. So if you weren't watching what I was playing, it would pretty much sound like you wouldn't know necessarily when I'm crossing strings. So when you listen to recordings of Holdsworth playing, etc., you can't always hear when he's crossing strings, and that's because of exactly this kind of technique. So when we're going upwards in pitch or down the guitar fretboard, what I tend to do is mute with my right hand. So I'll go and then put the base of my thumb or the base of my palm on the string. So we'll start with this sound, and then I mute it with like that, see? So slow it right down. So that way I'll mute with the palm of my hand on my right hand or my picking hand. When I'm coming back downwards in pitch, that's a lot harder to do. You're not going to really be able to mute unless you're going to mute with some sort of hybrid picking technique. What I do is use my left hand finger, and so coming down, looking for that sound. And then what I do is just roll my finger, so you start with that sound, just roll my finger so that it mutes the string above it. So I hope that helped, guys. I really do. If you're interested in checking out more of my legato based stuff, videos up here on the side here, and one for scale patterns on legato, and also some more videos on kind of the technique of legato as well, more technical aspect. Right guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, get practicing your piano technique crossing strings and your all hammer-on approach legato, and I promise you the work will absolutely pay off and your legato will be considerably more fluid. Take it easy, guys.